Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. This is Sue Ann Jackson from the State Unit on Aging, and I want to welcome you all to the very last webinar of the 2017 series. We won't have one in December because it's so close to the holidays, but I'm excited for the one we have today for you. I have Kelsey Gleason here with me, and she's got some great information to share. I just want to go over a couple things with you guys. We are recording this, and we will have it closed captioned, and then we will post it, and that usually all happens within just a few days. So we hope to have it up no later than early next week on our training website for you folks to review. We have you muted so that the recording won't have any static or craziness from headphones or cell phones. So if you have questions, text chat them in, and Kelsey and I have already talked about it, and we will take the questions as they come. So we're excited to have you guys interact with her. If you have folks at a group site, please text chat whoever else is there with you. And I think we caught up with everybody, but if for some reason you did not get the materials or a copy of the PowerPoint, just email Lori, Lori, .c as in cat, .watt, W-A-T-T, at state.or.us, and put in the subject line that you need the materials for the webinar, and she will shoot them right off to you. And we always like to remind you that after the webinar, within that hour, Lori will send out email with a link to the Survey Monkey so you can tell us how we did and how we can do better next time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey. I'm so excited for the info she has, and I'll be watching for your questions as she gives you the information. So I'm going to let her tell you who she is and why we have her here today.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. I am Kelsey Gleason. I am the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Policy Analyst for the Department of Human Services. A little bit about me. I've been working with deaf and hard of hearing communities for almost 10 years. I originally wanted to be an American Sign Language interpreter. That's kind of how I got started with the community. And then during my interpreter training program, I just realized that I was a better advocate. So I ended up transferring my degree to Deaf Studies, finishing my bachelor's in political science, and that has led me to working for the state. So here I am. So yeah, that's my background. Obviously, I am hearing, but I am proficient in American Sign Language, and I work with deaf and hard of hearing consumers and requesters of accommodation services every single day.
And we did debate yesterday whether or not to have her on the camera so that you guys could see her and she would be able to sign language if she needed to. And we decided not to do that this time, but it's available another time.
Maybe in the future, definitely. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and start off. So right now we're going to talk about best practices with deaf and hard of hearing consumers. Pretty much just the basics. We're going to get into a little bit of deafhood as a cultural identity. And then we're going to talk about different types of accommodations that we can provide. And then we're going to talk about how to use those accommodations. Like Sue Ann said, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, please, just shoot them off. We're going to run this totally deaf culture, so we'll just pause to answer those questions as they come. No need to hold them on to the end or anything like that. And with that, is it this button right here? Awesome. Okay, so on the first slide here, I kind of have a little bit of a breakdown of identities within the deaf and hard of hearing communities. And you can see that I have quite a few different identities listed here. So we have big D deaf, which signifies that there is a cultural identity there. We have a small d deaf. We have big B deaf blind, which also signifies cultural identity. We have little d, little b deaf blind. We have deaf with additional disabilities, late deafened, hard of hearing, and children of deaf adults. Now, A lot of the times when I talk about cultural identity within the deaf and hard of hearing community and identifying as culturally deaf, sometimes I get some inquisitive looks from people. And they ask me, well, you know, isn't it a disability? It's not a culture. And I like to reply that I don't believe that they're mutually exclusive. Hearing loss is a disability, a physical disability. However, there is a cultural identity aspect to this community. And that comes in because we know academically that culture requires two things. It requires language and it requires social norms. And we know that those who identify as culturally deaf, they use assigned language in this country. It's American Sign Language. And they also have their own social norms. And those two aspects together create a cultural identity. And I'm just going to pause right there for any questions, comments, concerns.
I want to mention that we talked also yesterday about how much information she has on her PowerPoint today, and she did that purposefully because this PowerPoint will then be a resource for you guys.
Absolutely.
So she is not going to just read everything off. She's going to talk about what's on there, but it will be a resource for you all after, and of course we will post it also with the recording on the website when we get it.
Yep. And I'm also going to take that link and I'm going to have that link posted on the website where you put in your request for accommodation. So we'll hope to have that available as wide as possible. All right. So on to the next. Oh, did we get a question?
Oh, we do have a question. Look at that.
Okay.
So people who become deaf later in life may not share the social norms that are part of the younger deaf community?
Yes, Jennifer, that's absolutely correct. So people who become deaf later in life usually don't learn American Sign Language because they've been hearing a majority of their life, so they use whatever spoken language that they've grown up with. We see this with, so late deafened people, we usually see that with people who are getting older. You know, hearing loss is just kind of a part of the aging process. But then we also see it with, like a good example is with vets who are returning from war, and perhaps they were in some situations where there were very loud sounds that caused them to have hearing loss. And in that case, they usually rely on some sort of assistive technology. I've only known maybe a handful in my lifetime that went on to try and learn a sign language in order to kind of mitigate their hearing loss. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. They don't really share that cultural identity. Thanks for that question, by the way, that was great. Okay, so next slide has a quote from Dr. Canapel, who works at the Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., which is the world's only liberal arts college for deaf and hard of hearing people. That means that all of their classes are taught in American Sign Language. And this quote is really about deafhood as a cultural identity, kind of a little bit more on that piece. And I use the word deafhood rather than deafness because deafness really relates to hearing loss as a disability, whereas deafhood relates to that deaf cultural identity and those shared experiences that people have in their life, the most notable being whether they attended a state residential school for the deaf or not. That's a very key factor in someone identifying as experiencing deafhood. So some of the values, behaviors, and traditions of deaf culture are included here. And I took this directly from Gallaudet University's website, and I highly encourage you, if you have want to do more research on your own, they have lots of best practice papers, lots of information on their peer-reviewed articles, that sort of stuff. It's a great wealth of knowledge. So getting to the values and behaviors that kind of identify deaf culture, main one is promoting an environment that supports vision and American Sign Language as the primary mode of communication. This means that in buildings there are open floor plans, that there's good use of windows as dividing space so that people can still communicate through them, and also lighting is a big factor. The culturally deaf community also values deaf children very highly. They see them as the future of the culture, and a lot rests on their shoulders. They also support bilingual ASL and English education. We know now from many peer-reviewed studies and research that children who are born with a significant hearing loss as deaf, that if they do not have that foundation of American Sign Language or some sign language initially, that in order to build English on top of that, it's very, very hard without that base of American Sign Language. And so we find that deaf children, whether they use cochlear implants or hearing aids as assistive technology, they will fall behind a little bit of their peers, their hearing peers, when it comes to English language acquisition. But we find that if they have that base of American Sign Language first, and they pair them together, that's when we find that deaf people are most successful, because it gives them that ability to operate within the dominant hearing culture as well. There's the inclusion of specific rules and behaviors within conversation that's, has to do with turn taking, making sure that you maintain eye contact, that sort of thing. If you ever want to experience anything like that, feel free to come to one of our Oregon Deaf and Hard of Hearing advisory committees. It's quite the experience, and just sit in and watch how the meeting functions with 3 sign language interpreters and communication access real time, which is live captioning. It's something to behold, definitely. There's also the perpetuation of deaf culture through many different traditions. The deaf community has their own films that are all in sign language. They have their own folklore. They have athletic teams like the Deaf Olympics. They have their own poetry, ASL poetry, their own famous poets. They have celebrations, clubs, organizations, theaters, and of course, state residential schools for the deaf. And then I think the most notable or noticeable aspect of deaf social norms is how they get people's attention. And if someone's in your line of sight, then they'll kind of wave their hand in front of you. If there's a large group of people and someone wants to make an announcement, they'll flick the lights on and off to get everybody's attention, those types of things. It's very obviously visual. All right. Any questions, concerns, comments?
Not seeing anything, Kel.
All right. So next we're going to talk about maybe some myths, and I highly encourage you, if you see one on here, or if you don't see one on here, please share something. If you have an experience, if you have an anecdote or anything like that, that's great. I love to kind of get that feedback and get those real world experiences. So the first myth that I hear very often is that American Sign Language is a universal language, or that sign language in general is universal. And that is absolutely untrue. There are so many different types of signed languages around the world. And even within ASL, there are different signing variations that can indicate regionality, much like an accent. So a deaf person in Mobile, Alabama is going to sign completely differently than a deaf person in Seattle, Washington.
Wow.
Absolutely, yeah, there is a huge difference there. different nomenclature, different signs, different movements, those types of things. ASL is not a visual version of English. American Sign Language has its own grammar structure that is completely different than English. It follows more of the Romance languages, and that comes historically because a lot of American Sign Language was borrowed or modified from French Sign Language. And it is, American Sign Language is a recognized language in its own right. We can thank Dr. William Stokey at Gallaudet University for that research. Next myth, lip reading is not a reliable source if it does not have a supporting method of communication with it. We know statistically that if somebody is relying on lip reading alone, only about 20% of what is trying to be communicated is actually coming through on someone's lips. And that can be greatly influenced on several things. If the person has a large mustache, or if the person is wearing a lipstick color that is distracting, or the person is too far away, so many factors. Kind of the best practice is to not rely on lip reading. Many hard of hearing consumers who use assistive technologies like cochlear implants and hearing aids do use lip reading as kind of a supplement to that. And it's helpful that if you have a consumer who is using an assistive technology like that, that you make sure that you do face them and make eye contact when you speak so that they can lip read as well. So it's not a standalone way to work with a consumer on a one-on-one basis, but it is helpful when paired with other types of accommodation. Another misconception is that deafness, hearing loss is genetic, and that deaf kiddos are born to deaf parents. Actually, about 90% of children who are born with significant hearing loss are born to hearing parents. So only about 10% of those families are what we call, generationally culturally deaf. So when these 90% of deaf kiddos are born, their hearing parents are usually a little bit in shock and want to know what they can do to help their child, or maybe try to fix them. So that is a source of great contention within the community, and that is a webinar for another day. Hearing aids, cochlear implants, other assistive technologies are not cures, and those who identify as culturally deaf may not choose to use them. A lot of the people that I know, they are, I've heard this, well, not heard, but seen this many times, the statement, "I'm not disabled, I just use a different language than you do." And again, that kind of gets back at that cultural piece where a lot of people feel that they can navigate the world just fine. Their disability does not impede them in any way. It's the language aspect. It's that that the predominant culture and predominant society does not know their language. And a lot of the times when hearing people meet a deaf person or they work with a deaf person, it's the first time they've ever met a deaf person. So they don't know what type of accommodation to provide, or how to even go about asking for that. And then last but not least, most people with hearing loss do not appreciate the term hearing impaired. And those that are culturally deaf see this as an offense. And that gets back to the "I'm not disabled, I just use a different language." Culturally deaf people, they don't see themselves as impaired, they're not broken, they don't need to be fixed, they're deaf. That's their identity. And they use American Sign Language, and that's it. And so the term hearing impaired, a lot of the times it kind of makes us as hearing people feel a little better that we are, we're not using a term like, deaf or dumb or anything like that. When you say the word deaf, a lot of times that old saying comes back into your brain, and you know that to be untrue. So you want to go with a word or a phrase that is miles away from that, but actually hearing impaired is far more offensive than deaf. And I do know quite a few hard of hearing consumers, people who do identify as hearing impaired. I'm not saying that there are people out there who don't identify as hearing impaired. There are quite a few. And actually one of my coworkers identifies as hearing impaired. But I largely see this as a generational aspect. I see older people identifying as hearing impaired, and definitely I don't see anybody who identifies as culturally deaf also identifying as hearing impaired. It doesn't happen. And I see that we have a question.
Right, let's see what it is. How about hard of hearing? Is that an acceptable term for people who aren't completely deaf?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. That is absolutely the preferred nomenclature. I also tend to use, a person with a hearing loss. We want to go with, person-centered language. And hearing loss kind of covers the gamut, whether that be, significant or minor hearing loss or some stage in between. Hearing loss is always a great term to go with. Hard of hearing and deaf. Those are the three that I use on a regular basis. So that's a great question. Thank you, Jennifer. All right, I'm going to pause for any more questions, comments, concerns. All right.
Not seeing anything more.
Let's move on. Okay, so now we're going to get into some nitty gritty.
Oh, I had to do the question.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, thinking about accommodation. So I have kind of split the screen here with the qualifier being language use. So under Big D deaf, deaf blind, deaf with additional disabilities, those are going to be people who identify as culturally deaf or within the cultural community. And thus we have these types of accommodations. We have American Sign Language interpreters, tactile interpreters for those who are deaf blind, certified deaf interpreters, video relay service, video remote interpreting, and gesture. And then on the other side, we have our hard of hearing, we have late deafened, we have deaf blind, and those are going to be people who still rely on English and auditory communication as their main method. So my first tip has to do with working with those who use sign language as their predominant mode of communication. Now, a lot of the times, when a deaf person comes up to your window or you're making first contact, you're not going to have a sign language interpreter. Deaf people don't just have an interpreter hanging out with them. It's inappropriate to use children of deaf adults as interpreters, friends, family, that sort of thing. We want to stay away from that, particularly when working with governmental entities. So when you don't have an interpreter, what do? Well, my first suggestion is not being afraid to act out or mime things with your consumer. I know that feels really awkward and maybe even kind of embarrassing for some of us who are of the predominant hearing culture. But we also know from some of our other trainings that we've all taken that a lot of information is actually conveyed through body language. And when you take that extra step to write notes back and forth, to gesture your meaning, to try to explore maybe some voice-to-text technology on your cell phone, your consumer is going to really appreciate that, because you're showing that sense of humility to them, and that you're going to go the extra mile to make sure that they get the services that they need, and make sure that they get the accommodation eventually that they need. All right, so my next tip is with your hard of hearing, late deaf and deafblind, those who still use English and auditory communication. And I talked a little bit about this earlier. So this tip is to make sure that you are, when you're having a direct conversation, that you try and maintain eye contact, and that you make sure that your face is facing them. And I have to remind myself of this constantly. It's no easy feat. I'm a multitasker, and a lot of times when I'm working with my hard of hearing coworker, you know, he'll ask me a question, and then I'll look down at my piece of paper, or I'll look at my computer screen, and I'll answer him, but I'm not facing him, so he can't read my lips. And I'm not facing him, so that means that his hearing aids can't pick up my speech very well, because the sound source the sound is facing away. It's facing at the computer screen, or it's going down towards the table that I'm looking at. It's not going at him or his hearing aids. So it's harder to determine where that sound is coming from, what's being said, those types of things. So just making sure that we maintain good eye contact, and that we're facing those that we're talking to who are relying on assistive technology and lip reading. Okay, so these next couple of slides have a lot of content on them, and basically they're tips for how to use these different types of accommodations. I really don't like when people do webinars or presentations where they sit there and read off every single slide. So that's not what we're going to do. So here on this slide, we have accommodation that ASL sign language users are going to kind of flock to. So we have sign language interpreters. There's some best practices with those, when you're going to need 2 interpreters, when you can get away with 1, where the interpreter should be positioned, that sort of thing. Then we talk about tactile interpreters. Those are interpreters that work with deaf-blind consumers. And you might be thinking, well, how would a deaf-blind person see the sign language? And that's a great question. They don't see it, they feel it. And if you're curious about what that looks like, I highly recommend just Googling the word pro-tactile, that's P-R-O-T-A-C-T-I-L-E, and find a YouTube video of 2 deaf-blind people chatting. It is very fascinating to watch. Oh, we have a question here. I'm going to take a pause.
Okay. For later in the presentation, one best practice we've been using, this is from Rebecca, is to always amplify the sound in any meeting and require all participants in the meeting to speak into the microphone, regardless of their belief, if they're loud enough so their voice can project. Many people who use hearing devices are still unable to pick up sound in group settings and get excluded. This puts the responsibility on the meeting, people who are holding the meeting, and not on the person that's participating in the meeting, which is a great idea.
Yeah, Rebecca, that is perfect. You are doing a great job accommodating your hard of hearing coworkers and stakeholders, people who are in your meetings. Another thing that we do that in our Oregon Deaf and Hard of Hearing Advisory Committee meetings that really, really helps is we ask each speaker to identify themselves before they speak. And that can be, you know, you can have to remind people several times throughout the meeting, but that is helpful for not only interpreters, but live captioners and those who are taking the minutes for your meeting, that sort of thing. It's really, really helpful. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And yeah, projecting is a huge piece. And if you can get extra mics, that's even better. All right, so next, so we talked a little bit about tactile interpreters. Go and look up ProTactile if you're interested in seeing that. Then we have certified deaf interpreters. These are interpreters that are deaf themselves, and they actually, we use them to provide that cultural expansion during assignments. And then they also are very useful in assignments where perhaps the deaf consumer is experiencing some sort of trauma, and we want to make sure that the communication is very clear in those assignments. Excuse me just one second. Okay, and then the type of accommodation y'all might use the most is actually a video relay service. And this is a service that's provided by the FCC at no cost to either party. And so this is just how deaf people use the telephone. Deaf people will, a lot of them will have a video phone at home. And so when they go to place a telephone call to a hearing person, an interpreter in a warehouse somewhere in the country shows up on their screen of their video phone, so the deaf person and the interpreter can see each other. And then the interpreter in that warehouse, wherever they are, dials the phone number that the deaf person gives them and places the call to the hearing person. Then the hearing person picks up their telephone just like they would anybody else, and the hearing person's going to hear something along the lines of, "This is interpreter number 12345. I have a deaf person who is placing a call." And then you will just hold on or say okay, and the interpreter starts interpreting what the deaf person's saying. So the hearing person can hear the interpreter and the deaf person can see the interpreter, and then you just carry on the conversation one-on-one, pretending like the interpreter isn't there at all.
So this is a good thing for your INR staff to know.
Yeah.
They may get these kind of calls.
Yeah, and a lot of the times I hear from consumers that, you know, I've been trying to call this person and they just keep hanging up. And that's because the hearing person hears that this is interpreter number 12 or something along those lines, and they think that it's maybe a spam call or something, so they just hang up. So I really encourage you to screen your calls, and if you do find that a deaf person's trying to call you, just hang on, and the interpreter will make sure that all the communication goes through appropriately.
Oh, looks like we have a question. AAA's, Area Agencies on Aging, may already know how this works, but can you explain how one makes a call to a deaf person using the VRS?
Yeah, absolutely. So you call a deaf person just like you would any hearing person. If a deaf consumer leaves a telephone number for you, you can pretty much assume, okay, let me back up. If a deaf consumer leaves a telephone number for you and does not specifically say, you can only text me at this number, like this is my cell phone, you can only text me, then you can pretty much assume that they have a video phone. And then you would just pick up the telephone, dial the number, and the call automatically goes through VRS. It'll be sent to a VRS interpreting company, and the interpreter will answer the call if the deaf person answers. If the deaf person does not answer, then the interpreter will say, "Oh, that person isn't home. Would you like to leave a message?" In that case, you can leave a message. You would just leave it however you would. The interpreter will interpret what you're saying and leave a video message on their phone. All right, so thanks, Jennifer, that was great.
And I did talk with Kelsey yesterday when we were prepping for this webinar. We did talk about how she sometimes will use a FaceTime.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you guys have iPhones and you want to FaceTime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're proficient in sign language, or maybe your consumer wants to read your lips at the same time. I've been working with the agency to try and get a video phone. So the FCC will provide them to deaf people at no cost when they provide their audiogram. But hearing people, if you want to have a video phone where deaf people can call you, you have to pay out of pocket for that. So we get around that with, you know, all of our different types of technology, with FaceTime, with Skype, with Glide is a great one because you can actually leave messages with Glide. So any type of video chat technology, deaf people are extremely savvy at it. And I just let them know, hey, this is when I'm available. Here's the email address that you can FaceTime me at. And then I just bring my personal iPad and get it all set up.
And we are actually, the State Unit on Aging is working on a webinar, excuse me, early next year, sometime between January, February, and March, with folks from assistive technology. So we will be able to hear about all the kinds of different.
Oh, with ATI?
Yeah.
ATI is awesome.
So we're working on getting that for you also, but we wanted to get you started with this one, and we didn't want to wait.
Absolutely. And so my unit, the Advocacy and Development Unit, we staff 4 boards and commissions, one of which is the Oregon Disabilities Commission, and we're hoping to make it annual, but we've been doing an ADA celebration on the anniversary of the ADA for the past couple of years, and we've had assistive technologies come out and do a whole display room of all these different types of technologies, whether they be captioned phones, vibrating and flashing alarms, doorbells that have video or have cameras in them, those types of things. So those are great. And if you need any of those resources, just let me know. I have plenty. Okay, so on to accommodations for hard of hearing, or those consumers that still use English or auditory communication. So we have captions. A good best practice is if you know that you have consumers, employees who are hard of hearing or deaf, and you're going to be showing them a video of some sort, it's got to be captioned. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no reason why it shouldn't be captioned. If you have a video that you want to show that doesn't have captioning, let me know. I can forward you on to a great company that provides live captioning for us, and they can do all the post-production stuff for you. So no worries with that. Then communication acts as real-time, or the acronym we call CART. That is essentially just live captioning. And we have 2 service providers that provide CART for us. It can be provided in person or remotely. When we provide it remotely, we just need a phone line to call into, and then the service provider will give us a link, and then you can open that link and just follow along with the captioning live, and you can follow along anywhere. You can follow along on your iPad or your phone and your personal device, at your desk, wherever. We provide CART for all of our deaf and hard of hearing advisory committees as well. So like I said, if you want to stop by and see how that works, please feel free to. Last but not least, we have FM amplification and loop technology. Now, FM amplification is kind of the old sibling of loop technology. I have one FM amplification system at my desk, which I can loan out to any entity that requests it. Basically, it's 2 receivers. One of the receivers has a headphone jack that the consumer wears the headphones. The other receiver has an external mic, and the presenter or speaker will either wear the mic or have it close to them. So then these 2 receivers basically talk to each other. So the deaf consumer or the hard of hearing consumer is just hearing that sound amplified in their own personal space. And then loop technology, the only building that I know of that is a state building that is equipped with loop technology is the Capitol. And that requires the actual room and building to be embedded with microphones. And then the consumer has basically a loop that goes around their neck. And a lot of the time now it's Bluetooth will feed into their hearing aid. So those mics in the room will feed into the person's hearing aid. So you're getting that direct sound. And so I just talked about a bunch of different types of accommodation, and you might be wondering, or maybe you'll be in a situation with a deaf or hard of hearing consumer and you're like, I don't know what to request for this person. I don't know if they need a sign language interpreter. I don't know if they need captioning. I don't know. A great way to figure that out is simply to ask the consumer. And I know that's like, well, duh, but a lot of people don't do it. And deaf and hard of hearing consumers, a lot of times they've been deaf or experienced some hearing loss in their entire life. And they've operated with the hearing predominant culture their entire life. So they know how to navigate it. They know what works best for them. And when I'm filling requests, I always go with consumer preference, whether that be type of accommodation or, a very specific interpreter or a very specific cart provider. If the consumer says, I want this, that's what I'm going to try and fulfill.
And Kelsey, you've been talking about all these great resources. And I know that one of the questions probably on people's minds is, how much do they cost? Can I afford to get these things, or they can come to you for help in getting the resource, but how do they afford it, or how does it get paid for?
So before I answer that question, I'm just going to draw your attention to our next slide, which is why is accessibility and accommodation important? So sign language interpreters are not cheap, and live captioning is not cheap. It is a federal requirement for us to provide this service. When we do not provide this service, our consumers are not getting equitable access to the services that we are supposed to provide to everybody.
So by us, you mean the state?
Yes. Okay. And governmental entities.
Okay.
Yeah. We are federally required by two acts, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disability Act. Both of those require state entities to provide accommodation, basically regardless of cost. Now, the ADA does talk about reasonable accommodation and undue burden. Now, you have to prove a significant undue burden. Basically, you have to prove that this consumer's request for accommodation is going to put you out of business to be able to deny them that request. And recently, the federal government has basically said, yeah, if it's not going to bankrupt you, then you got to do it. You got to figure out some way to do it. So currently, if you request American Sign Language interpreters or tactile CDIs, anything like that, through our services, our state services, interpreters are $55 an hour per interpreter. They can also bill the federal mileage rate for assignments that require more than 20 miles round trip. They can also bill for travel time if they travel more than 120 miles round trip. When we get out into Eastern Oregon, I have one interpreter in Pendleton. That's all I have for Eastern Oregon. So she does quite a bit of driving. With cart providers, it depends. Cart providers will charge more to provide the service in person. And it can range basically anywhere from $75 to $150 an hour. Yeah. Okay, so yes, accessibility and accommodation, super important. We're federally required to provide it. With this particular community, it is extremely close-knit. The culturally deaf community is a collectivist community within the largely American individualistic community. So they talk, they share information. Sharing information is a tenet of deaf culture. So if your services are not accessible, the deaf community will know that, and they'll stop trying. They'll just stop trying to access services or communicate with you in general. And then, but if your services are good, or you are, receptive to them, then you might see a flood of deaf people coming to you for services. We see this with vocational rehabilitation, which is kind of like a one-stop shop, because VR traditionally has the most deaf employees of any agency with state, and that makes the community very happy. All right, here are some general tips on making your website accessible and making your employees accessible. I had a conversation with some ADRC employees because I had received feedback from the deaf community that they didn't know what the ADRC was, and when they tried to contact them, they were either not receptive or it was not accessible. So one question I had was, well, what type of contact information do you have on the ADRC's website? And we found that the big key here was there was no email address for consumers to contact the ADRC on their general page. So we fixed that immediately, and making sure that you have other modes of communication other than just a telephone number is huge. That's going to be your number one. Then if you're working with a consumer one-on-one, like you're a case manager or some sort, consider text messages as a viable way for consumers to contact you. I text with people all the time. It's, text, email, that's how we get work done if you don't know sign language. I mean, even me being proficient in sign language, it's easier to just send a text message sometimes. It's just, that's the way the world goes. When you're working with consumers, or you're creating a document that is for deaf and hard of hearing people, try to avoid jargon or acronyms. I think that's kind of just a blanket statement for when we're working with communities and stakeholders in general. Like, we all know the state jargon that we have, or the local government jargon that we have, the acronyms of the stakeholders that we work with, and just making sure that that is really clearly communicated with consumers. That if I'm using the acronym like CODA or GOBI or OWAPI, that somebody knows what acronym I'm saying, what it stands for, and what that entity does. And I think in the beginning, it might be confusing to indicate what services a deaf consumer is in need of, but just hang in there. American Sign Language is its own language. Grammatically, it works much different than English, and so it might take you a while to get through a bunch of storytelling, but eventually you're going to get to what does this consumer need and how can I help them. All right, requesting accommodation. So these are the current accommodation types that I provide. I can schedule ASL interpreters, certified deaf interpreters, tactile interpreters. I can help schedule post-production video captioning, and I can schedule live captioning. At the bottom here is the link to our web form. So any state entity employee can request accommodation services. There's also a worker guide on that website at the top. If you need help filling out the form, you can also just email me with any questions, concerns, and I will pop you an email right back.
And I'm assuming your information is going to be at the end of the slideshow?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we're almost there. We're on our penultimate slide right now. Here are some resources. You can just copy and paste these names right into Google, and it should bring up everything. So we have the Oregon Deaf and Hard of Hearing Advisory Committee, which is staffed out of my unit. We have the Oregon Association of the Deaf, which is a local nonprofit organization. We have the Hearing Loss Association of America Oregon chapter. We have the Oregon School for the Deaf, which is part of the Oregon Department of Education. It's located here in Salem. That's our state residential school for deaf kiddos. We also have the Regional Resource Center on Deafness. That's located at Western Oregon University in Monmouth. We have the Oregon Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. So that's the organization that for interpreters that work with deaf people and obviously Oregonians. We have the Northwest ADA Center, which is located in Seattle. They do provide free training for governmental entities, so I highly recommend checking them out. They also have a bunch of best practice papers and resources and all that good stuff. I'm part of an employee resource group called AbleNet, so employee resource group for people with disabilities. And we have found some really great information at the Northwest ADA Center about accommodation in the workplace. So I highly encourage you to check them out. Then we have the National Association of the Deaf, and we have the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. Those are kind of the national versions of our OAD and ORID. And then we have Gallaudet University, which I talked plenty about earlier.
Kelsey, one of the things I know that the Commission for the Blind does is to offer classes around the state with, and I've taken a couple of them. They were really awesome to help you understand what it feels like. Does the group that you work with offer anything like that?
I'm sure if they had the funding, they would. Unfortunately, they are not a commission, and the Commission of the Blind, I believe, has funding of about $1 million, at least this last budget cycle. That's what I was seeing. And for the past like 3 legislative sessions, the deaf and hard of hearing community has been really pushing to get an office for the deaf and the hard of hearing, so that all of this stuff, these resources, this accommodation scheduling, the services would be housed in one spot. But unfortunately, the legislature can't find the money yet. So maybe next year.
So we need to have more advocacy.
More advocacy. More.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Last slide. Big old thank you. In the bottom right corner is my email address and phone number. That's my desk phone. And I work, I telecommute on Fridays. I live in Portland, so I commute to Salem every day, but I work in Portland on Fridays. I'm also happy to take meetings, travel around the state. That's part of my job as an OPA too, is to go out into communities and meet with other agencies and that sort of thing. So I apologize if you're looking at printed slides. My email address didn't print out very well, but it's Kelsey, K-E-L-S-E-Y .Gleason, that's G-L-E-E-S-O-N @state.or.us. I'm also the only double E Gleason in the address book, so come and find me. And with that concludes our webinar. Did we have any follow-up questions, concerns, comments?
I just want to say, while you guys are thinking about it, that Christy Murphy and I have both found Kelsey's really, really accessible, so to speak. She's been great and has been right there, and I know that she worked with Christy on looking at the website, even though when you go to the map and you click over the area, you had an email address, but not on the main page. So I know that Kelsey has given us a lot of good tips and hints. And one of the things that she was telling me is that, you know, there might be ways that we can work things out somehow. You guys are all, if you have a contract with us, you're business associates. And so there may be ways, if you need some of these resources, we might be able to help you get them.
Yes.
So don't think it's just going to be too expensive. If you need the accommodation, get hold of me, get hold of Christy Murphy, get hold of Kelsey. We'll get hold of Kelsey, you know, connect And, you know, better to talk about it and find out it's not going to work, and maybe Kelsey can help you come up with some alternatives.
Absolutely.
Than to just not do it. Because like she said, the folks in the local community will spread the word. So you want to make sure that you are letting them know that you're at least trying.
Yeah, and just to, you know, solidify things, so who can request services from me? That's any governmental entity or any entity that contracts with a governmental entity. So that's, you know, boards, commissions, the city, county, state, anything like that. If you are, you know, receiving funds from the feds or from the state, then we can most likely provide accommodation for you. And we not only provide accommodation for your clients and consumers, we also provide accommodation for your deaf and hard of hearing employees. So we can do that too, and we're happy to work that out.
So that would be those of you in the AAAs or those of you in the Centers for Independent Living. I'm so appreciative that Kelsey had time to come and spend with us today.
Yeah.
I really want to thank her for being here. We're not seeing any questions, so we're kind of assuming that that means you guys don't have any, or you're going to be emailing her individually.
And I'm prepared for that.
So we will definitely get this going into closed caption and get it up by next week and post the PowerPoint with it. And again, I want to thank Kelsey so much for being here. We're so happy to know her and be working with her. And she's very available to all of you, so don't hesitate.
Yes. Thank you so much, and thank you for all your great questions. It was really helped and to clarify some things and bring some stuff up that I didn't cover.
And keep an eye open. It looks like we have a question, but keep an eye open for when that ATI, Assistive Technology webinar is. And what we may try to do is have Kelsey back at that time, so that we have both she and the ATI folks talking about, you know, how we can better use these things and what can work better with us. So we want to thank you very much. And with that, it's the end of the webinar. It looks like we're getting a few thank yous. Great presentation, Kelsey. We appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Have a great afternoon. There is no webinar next month, but we hope to get a schedule out for you guys. Even though we don't have topics for next year, we will try to get a schedule out so you can get the dates on your calendars. We'll hang out for a minute or two in case anybody thinks of a question. Thanks very much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.